You know, I believe that you can better enjoy a holiday if you understand it. So I'm going to take you through the history of Christmas and all our beloved traditions and rituals. Do we actually know why we hang stockings? Do we know why we kiss under the mistletoe? Well, you will in just a few moments. So we're going to start at the very beginning. Of course, Christmas is inherently a religious holiday. So in the first few centuries, it was solely a religious moment. But then it became actually a evangelistic tool. Now, I know some of you have probably been told that Christmas coincides with December 25th because there was a Roman festival called Saturnalia, and so our whole celebration of Christmas is pagan. And this should bother you. I'm here to tell you, calm yourselves. It is not true. There was indeed a famous Roman festival called Saturnalia. It was to honor the birth of the sun god, the coming of light on the winter solstice, which is the 21st to 22nd of December. That is not the 25th. There was also a Roman New Year called Janus. It was from which we get January, which was honoring the forward and backward looking god of doorways and new beginnings. But that's not December 25th either. December 25th was decided upon by the Catholic Church centuries later, after it had been developed a tradition by the early Christians of celebrating the birth of Christ, the light of the world, at the celebration of the Festival of Lights of the Jewish people, Hanukkah. This is why so often Hanukkah and Christmas are in the same time frame. The reason that they don't exactly coincide is because the Jewish festival changes slightly every year with the lunar calendar, and the church wanted to establish a formal date. Now, something you may not realize is that the Bible actually gives us a very strong hint about when Jesus was actually born. And you're going to be shocked when you hear this, if you have not already. You may remember that Jesus had a cousin named John the Baptist who was born 6 months before Jesus. We can pinpoint pretty accurately when John was born and therefore when Jesus was born. Because if you remember, John's father was a priest and he went to the temple for his annual service. The priests at that time had 2 weeks of every year when they had to give service at the Jerusalem temple. Back in the day of King David, there had become so many priests that King David divided up all the families of priests and assigned them a specific 2-week period of the year. The Gospels tell us when John's father would have been serving because it tells us his family. Therefore, we know when he was in the temple serving. That would have been mid-June. We are then told that his wife immediately conceived. So this would mean that John was conceived roughly the end of June. 9 months would put him at the Passover time in the spring of the next year. Exactly when the Old Testament says that the spirit of Elijah would come as the messenger for the Messiah. 6 months from John would put Jesus' birth appropriately the end of September. The Catholics have long celebrated a feast called Michaelmas on September the 28th, where they celebrate the coming of the angels from heaven at the to the Bethlehem shepherds. If they are correct, and September 28th, which aligns much more precisely than the end of December for shepherds in the Holy Land being out watching their flock by night. If the Catholics are correct, and September 28th is the actual birthday of Jesus, if you take the perfect gestation period for a human baby and you count backward, that means that Jesus Christ was conceived by the Holy Spirit on December 25th. Which frankly, it is the conception as opposed to the birth that is the true miracle. And therefore, if you have been worried that you are celebrating a pagan holiday, calm thyself. The only thing that we really get from Saturnalia and the Calids of January is the fact that we do festoon our homes and now churches with greenery. Because again, they were celebrating the birth of the sun, of light coming into the world. And so evergreens were given as gifts by Roman people, one to another, during this period of time, to remind them that indeed the greenery would come back, the sun was being reborn. Now the early Christians took the branches, the boughs, and turned them into a circle, the sign of eternity. And then when their pagan friends asked them, why have you made a circle, they used it as an evangelistic tool to talk about the eternal life. And that is why we hang greenery. Now, speaking of greenery, I think it's always appropriate to carry a portable mistletoe, for one never knows when one might want to be kissed. So I carry this around. Now, we all know that you kiss under the mistletoe. This actually comes from the Druids in England. The Druids had long believed that mistletoe was a sacred herb and used it for medicinal purposes. In the Middle Ages, you actually would carry mistletoe with you as a medicinal herb, kind of like a portable first aid kit. And when you would be out on the meadow or in the valley and someone would approach you, if you did not know them and you wanted to let them know that you're not a threat to them, you would take your mistletoe out and wave it to them. They would see that and know that you meant nothing but good for them. Now, the Victorians have a wrongful we have a wrongful perception of the Victorians as being very prudish. But you know, what appears on the surface may not always be what's underneath. And particularly at Christmas, the Victorians like to have a little fun. And it is from the Victorian era that we get the idea of kissing under the mistletoe. Now, mistletoe has these little white berries. So here's what would happen. You would put the mistletoe, hang it in your house. And when people wanted to kiss, they would take their partner under the mistletoe and kiss them. But when they did, they had to take off one of these berries. When all the berries were gone, all the kissing was done. This is probably why Southerners, of whom I'm happily one, we decided that we did not wish to be so limited. And that is why in Southern households, you do not see mistletoe, but rather kissing balls. Because that way, we don't worry about how many berries there are. Kissing is always a good thing. Now, so how did we get our modern Christmas celebration? Well, in the Middle Ages and in the High Renaissance, Christmas became raucous. I want you to think Mardi Gras. I want you to think crazy parties, dancing, yes, licentious behavior, and costumes and masks. If you've ever read or seen the movie The Hunchback of Notre Dame, you know that there was a day in the 12 days of Christmas called Topsy-Turvy, when a king of the day would have been voted on. This was a time for peasants to dress like and act like kings, and a time for the royalty and the gentry to dress like peasants and and behind a mask, get to just be regular people. So Quasimodo in the story if you remember, becomes king for a day. And everyone has to do what that gentleman said to do. Now, you may recall from your history that in 1640s in England, there was an English Civil War. And the Puritans took over. They weren't just a religious group, they were a political group. And they did not approve of this, so they outlawed Christmas. Now, in America, the Puritans, that same group, had just settled the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And this is why, for the longest time, Christmas celebrations were downplayed in New England, whereas the South and the Middle colonies celebrated them. With the outlawing of Christmas, a lot of the traditions died out, as you can imagine. And frankly, by the turn of the 1800s, Christmas was not the huge celebration that we think of it as today. Several years ago, there was a movie that came out in the theaters called The Man Who Invented Christmas. It was the real life story of Charles Dickens, who is credited with really reinventing and bringing back Christmas traditions. And so a lot of the things that we think of as a traditional Christmas really came from, or at least were reincarnations of, things that Charles Dickens ushered in. Now, the reason I say this is because of this dear little book. This is a replica of the original A Christmas Carol. It came out on December 19, 1843. It's a small novella. It was beautifully done. Charles Dickens requested and actually required that it be made of the highest quality. So it's very expensive. And yet, by Christmas Eve, it had completely sold out. It took England by storm, and eventually, of course, America too. In addition, two other things interesting happened in that very important year of 1843 from a Christmas standpoint. One was that the first Christmas card was produced. And I have that right here. I'm going to pass this around. What you're going to see is a family all gathered, including a little girl, and they're feasting. Well, so far, so good. But it was very controversial because if you look closely, this little tiny toddler is imbibing in red wine. Now, in France, that would not be a problem because they guzzle everything all the time. But in England, this was very controversial. And so, but that did not stop anything. No. And by the way, the first person to ever send one was Sir Henry Cole, who was in business. This, my friends, was a marketing ploy for his customers. Christmas cards became very popular almost instantaneously because in that very same year, 1843, the penny post was invented. So everybody, the working class as well as the more well-heeled, could send many, many Christmas cards. Now, in addition, there had come to the throne a beautiful queen, Queen Victoria, who had just married the handsome German Prince Albert. And they became the it couple. Anything those two young people did, everybody wanted to be just like them. In the 1840s, they started having children. And as you know, they would wind up having many children. This lithograph of the royal family standing in their palace next to a tabletop Christmas tree became the #1 lithograph sold during that time. It was in everything. I'm going to pass this around. When people saw this, they said, "We want to be just like them." And so the Christmas tree craze began. Now, it had already been being done to some extent in Germany, because yes, Christmas trees come from Germany. Now, there are several different origin stories, but the one I personally like the best, and I think is the best researched, is the one that gives credit to the great Protestant reformer, Martin Luther. The story goes that Martin Luther was walking through the woods on a winter evening. He looked up through the branches of the trees, saw the sparkling stars, thought it was beautiful, and wanted his family to see that. So he chopped down a tree and attached candles to it, brought it home, put it on a table so that he could recreate that moment for his family. Now, the first evidence that we actually have that the Christmas tree was in America comes from a drawing in 1812 in a German family enjoying their Christmas tree. Now, if you've ever wondered how in the world could you safely have lighted candles on a tree, well, this is how you would do it. We have a tree at my home that is exactly decorated according to Victorian standards. There was a very popular story that came out in 1870 called The Christmas Tree. And it described exactly how a Victorian tree should be decorated, and mine is. Now, this is how candles would have been done. You see, there's a little metal base, and so my finger would be the branch of the tree. There's a weight on the bottom, so if it gets knocked, you see it rights itself. So that's how the candles were done. You can imagine, however, that this was dangerous with live fire, and so what they would do is you would create the Christmas tree, the adults would, behind closed doors. And then on Christmas Eve, and only on Christmas Eve, you would light the candles and then throw open the doors for the children to rush in and see this glorious thing for about 15 minutes. And then you would blow out the candles. Now, on the tree originally would have been treats that could have been eaten. So no carrying ornaments up to the attic afterward. This is actually an example of the type of cookies that would have been done. And if you come closer later, you'll see that it's very elaborate. This is the proverbial partridge in the pear tree from the famous song, The 12 Days of Christmas. They also would have fruit, but it was always something that was edible. If you've ever wondered where we got popcorn streamers, it's because those popcorn strings could be eaten. You see, Christmas has traditionally been about the food. It really has. Has anyone ever wondered about that 12 Days of Christmas song? There are an awful lot of birds being given. Did you notice that? A lot of birds. Now, I like birds all right, but I don't need a zoo of them. And I always thought, well, at least somebody got some 5 gold rings. Well, I need to break it to you, my friends. The gold rings that are being talked about in that story are not these kind of rings. They are our feathered friends. There are gold-ringed birds whose necks, the feathers on the neck, were gold. Why so many gifts of birds? Because they were going to get ate. That's why that was the food for the 12 Days of Christmas. The 12 Days of Christmas originally began on Christmas Day and went all the way to January 6th, the Feast of the Epiphany, the traditional holiday celebrating the coming of the wise men. Now, if I were to ask you all, what is the climax of the Christmas season, you would probably say December 25th, Christmas Day. But for anybody before, say, the 1900s, they would have told you 12th night, the night of January the 6th. Because that would have been the 12th night party and the great big cake. As late as the late 1800s, giant cakes the size of a table would have been made for these huge parties that people would have. And everybody would take a slice of the cake. In the cake would be silver charms that would tell you about your luck for the new year. But there was a symbol that many of the men did not want to get, and that was a bean. Because if you got the slice with the bean, the cost and responsibility for next year's 12th night party was on you. And there are stories about the men doing all kind of shenanigans to try to avoid getting the big. Now, let us talk a moment back about the trees. How many of you have a full-size tree, not just a tabletop tree? Raise your hand. All right? Then let me explain how we went from tabletop trees to full-size trees. You see, in 1880, there was a man who owned a chain of stores throughout America. You'll know him in a moment. He went to Germany and he fell in love with what were called baubles. This is a bauble. It is a large glass ornament that the Germans would make. He ordered millions of these shipped to all of his stores throughout America. And that Christmas season, they sold out. They went like hotcakes. Now, I don't like hotcakes, so I didn't remember what it was. Now, if you look at this, this is very beautiful, but I want you to pretend that you had a bunch of these on a small tree. Can you say timber? And so, in order to accommodate the larger ornaments, people started getting bigger and bigger trees. So my friends, the name of that gentleman was Woolworth, as in the Woolworth store chain. So dear ones, if you have a full-size tree this year, you can thank Mr. Woolworth's great big balls. Of course, we cannot not talk about Santa Claus. If somebody ever asks you, is Santa Claus real? You can, with a very good conscience, say, absolutely. Because it is true. There absolutely is a Santa Claus. You see, Santa Claus is based on a real person. His name was Nicholas, and he became a saint in the Catholic Church. He was a bishop in Turkey, then Syria, now Turkey, in the 4th century. He had been born as the only child of a very wealthy couple who owned a fleet of fishing ships. They died when he was young, so he became an instant very wealthy man. But he was also a very godly man. He became a priest at a very young age. In fact, he was known as the boy bishop. But he also had a lot of money. And so he became very generous. But he didn't just send out money willy-nilly. He waited until he knew that there was a good cause, and then he would go quietly and anonymously and just leave money for people. The most famous anecdote about this is where we get the idea of the stockings. You see, at that time, there were allegedly 3 sisters in a day when, in order to marry, you had to have a dowry to bring with you into the marriage. They had none. And he found out about this. And so one night, he went to their home where their stockings, not this kind of stocking, not something specifically designated for the holiday, but regular stockings, underwear, were hung, not by a chimney to dry, but over a window ledge to dry. He put gold coins in the stockings of the 3 sisters. And so they were able to marry their loves. Now, St. Nicholas was just a man, a good man, but nonetheless a man, and so of course he died. But a group of nuns living nearby wanted to continue his generosity, and so they took to giving acts of charity and money when the occasion arose anonymously, and they would leave little notes that said, "From St. Nicholas." Now, how does St. Nicholas look? I can probably guess how you see him in your mind's eye, but let me tell you how he looked to other generations. Originally, he looked like this, like a bishop, with the crook, a shepherd's crook, representing being a shepherd of the flock, kind of tall and gaunt, very similar to saints that you see in stained glass windows. But as time went by, he morphed. Now, it was the Dutch who really took to St. Nicholas first and made him such a symbol of Christmas. This brings us to 1820. There was a man by the name of Clement Clark Moore living in Boston. He thought he was the smartest man in America, or at least that's what he wanted you to think. He was an academician, and he wrote tomes mostly of theological philosophy. He had a 9-year-old daughter who had a Christmas party, and he just dashed off a cute little fanciful poem for the party. It was such a hit that one of the little girls took it home to her father, who happened to be the editor of a newspaper. He published this poem. Clement Clark Moore was horrified because he did not want to be associated with such drivel, such silliness. And for the next 40 years, he made sure nobody knew that he had been the writer of the poem that took America by storm. We, of course, know that poem as The Night Before Christmas, originally entitled A Visit from St. Nicholas. Clement Clark Moore's depiction of Santa was not this. It was based more on what the Dutch thought. And so we get the jolly Santa, the round belly, the chubby cheeks. But have you ever wondered why that poem says a miniature sleigh and 8 tiny reindeers? I don't think we think of Santa and the reindeers as little, do we? But you see, the Dutch did. They were elves. They were the size of elves, including Santa. Now, in the bleak days of the American Civil War, the North was not winning. A lot of people don't realize how close it was. And a lot of the Northerners in 1863 said, you know what, let's just let those rebels go. This is costing too much lives. Let's just make peace and let them go. And Abraham Lincoln said, no, this is a moral fight and we must fight on. So he turned to Thomas Nast, who was a cartoonist. You know Thomas Nast's work if you don't know his name, because it's Thomas Nast who created the elephant to represent Republicans and the donkey to represent Democrats. He turned to Thomas Nast and he said, I need you to do something in the magazines to increase the morale and the spirit of the Northern cause. And so he said Santa was going to report for duty to the Union Army. And so he put Santa in as a soldier. And we have many lithographs of Santa literally serving, giving gifts to the soldiers, but always, of course, in the Union and with Uncle Sam. After the war was over, Abraham Lincoln said that Thomas Nast, he played a huge part in increasing the morale of the North to fight on during a time when most Northerners were seriously considering making peace. But this is still not quite the Santa you know, because this one still has a long coat like a Father Christmas you might see in a Dickens story. So where did he get the little suit and the little black patent belt and all of that? Thank you, Coca-Cola! Because Coca-Cola had a marketing campaign in the early 1900s, and your idea of Santa Claus was Coca-Cola's. If you've ever wondered about the English tradition of poppers, this is absolutely fascinating. In the Victorian era, there was a man, his name was Cook, Thomas Cook. He had a candy store in London, and he came up with the idea of this because he saw how the French bonbons were so beautifully wrapped and how they got a lot of money for nothing else than the beautiful wrapping. And so he decided to do something like that, and he decided to make these for Valentine's Day. but they didn't do very well. They didn't sell well. Several years later, somebody said, why don't you try to do them at Christmas? And so the Christmas crackers or poppers were born. The reason they're called poppers or crackers is because when you pull on them, there's a pop or a crack, which made him think of the crackling and popping of a winter fire. Inside is always a crown and a joke and a toy. Now, my friends, there is so much more we could say, but because of time, we're going to close it here. But I wish to end this with what I think are the quintessential words to embody the spirit of Christmas. It is the closing lines of what I believe is the second greatest Christmas story ever told, A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. He did it all and infinitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he became a second father. He was as good a man, a good a master, and as good a friend as the good old city knew, or any other good old city, town, or village in the whole world. Oh, some people laughed to see the alteration in him, but he little heeded them and let them laugh, for he was wise enough to know that nothing ever happened on this globe for good, but which some people did not have their fill of laughter at the outset. His own heart laughed, and that was quite enough for him. He had no further intercourse with spirits, but lived upon the total abstinence principle ever after. And it was always said that he knew how to keep Christmas well, if any man alive possessed the knowledge. May that be said of us, and all of us. And so, as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us, everyone. Happy holidays.